God calls husbands to lead their wives, doesn't he? That's got to be in the Bible somewhere, right? Well, today on the Bare Marriage Podcast, we're going to find out. I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire from baremarriage.com, where we like to talk about healthy, evidence-based biblical advice for your sex life and your marriage. And I am so glad today I'm going to bring to you one of my favorite people on the internet, Marg Mowczko, who writes the most incredible, short, easy to understand, very accessible articles about everything to do with women and the Bible. She's my go-to resource for everything like that. I'm constantly sending people to her website. She's from Australia, and she's going to be here to talk about the meaning of headship and what God is actually saying about that. So that's coming right up. Before we get to her, just a special thank you to some people who make my life wonderful. And that is our Patreon supporters. They can give as little as $5 a month or even much more if they want to support us more, but that gets them into our private Facebook group. And our patron supporters allow us to keep this podcast going. A lot of people say to me, Sheila, is there a safe place where we can talk about all the issues that you raise in a private group? And there is. It's called our patron group. So you can find us at patreon.com/baremarriage. The link is in the podcast notes. And in the month of June, we are actually doing a special push to try to get some new monthly donors. I would really like to see 50 new donors, even at just $10 a month, either through Patreon or if you're in the US and you would like to get a tax deductible receipt through the Good Fruit Faith Initiative of the Bosco Foundation. So giving money through the Good Fruit Faith Initiative has allowed us to do things that I just couldn't do by myself. We have a number of academic papers coming out. We're working on some Spanish translations of some of our resources. We're working on a new podcast series and more. So when you give money through that, it just helps us expand what we're doing and just do so much more, because the world needs to hear how God really does feel about women. So the link to that is in the podcast notes too. We would love to have you join us. And if money isn't on the table, please remember that you can share our stuff. You can follow me on social media, even rating this podcast 5 stars, or rating any of the books that you've read. If you've enjoyed them, rating those 5 stars and leaving a review really helps us too. So now, without further ado, let's go to Sydney, Australia, and talk to Marg Mowczko. Well, Marg, it is so wonderful to see you again.
Great to see you, Sheila.
Yeah, I still think it's so funny that you're one of the few people that I've met multiple times that I know online, and you live on the other side of the world. So, yes.
The other hemisphere.
Yeah.
So I'm in winter now.
I know. And we're just getting into summer, which is wonderful. And thank you for joining me. It's super late at night your time, and it's super early in the morning my time. So this is pretty funny. But I love bringing on other people from the Commonwealth too. So good to get some Aussie voices out there.
Yeah.
I don't know when I first found you. I think it was 2014 or something like that. But it's been a while. It's been a long while. And I just love what you do, because you make all of these things so accessible. You just have super short articles on very specific things, and your website is so easy to use. And sometimes it's easier to point people to you than to a book, because a book you have to purchase, read the whole thing. But with you, you can just look up super short things. And I love that. So I was trying to figure out what I wanted to talk to people about. And I thought we could talk about the word head. But before we even jump into that, I would love to hear some of your story, because you did not start out as an egalitarian.
No, I didn't. No. So I got married quite young to my husband. We've been married over 40 years and still going really strong. And when we got married, we were both Christians. I was also a really keen Christian, those people who really want to do everything right, who really love God. And I thought to really please God, I would have to submit to my husband, and he would be the priest of the home and my head, the way that I understood head back then. And already within hours of making our wedding vows, that was challenged. So I don't know whether you know this story, because it's on my website. But like I said, we were quite young, and the master of ceremonies was our youth pastor, and he had brought an axe, and the handle was wrapped in toilet paper to the I was going to say banquet. What do you call it after the reception? Was a reception after, where the wedding cake was, and he thought it'd be great fun if we cut the wedding cake with this axe. And my husband said, yeah, sure. Like that's not a problem. But like, I just couldn't do that. I mean, it was a pretty dumb idea, but in particular,
Yes.
it was. But the wedding cake had been it had been made by a lady in the church, and she had totally given it to us. So we didn't pay for the ingredients, we didn't pay for her time or work. So this woman had made this beautiful two-tiered cake with love and given it to us. And so there was like no way that we were going to cut it with an axe. And I was really devastated that within, like I said, a couple of hours of vowing to, I don't think we said love and honor, but it was something along those lines. And I remember I did make the vow that I would follow my husband, like follow. I do remember that word was in there. That I was saying, no, we're not doing that. I said it really nicely. But yeah, I've said no plenty of times since then. And yeah, and also like this was in the 80s, and I read every Christian book about marriage that I could get my hands on. And my husband hated it. He just wanted me to be myself. And so at one point he said, stop reading those books. And so I did. Yeah. And our marriage improved dramatically after that.
I love that.
Yeah.
I actually hear that from a lot of people. Like, yeah, we're married to good men. It's like, no, I just wanted you to be you.
Yeah.
And when did you get into all the translation stuff and all the Greek learning?
So at some point in my Christian walk, I got saved when I was 10. I'm going to say 10. I'm not exactly sure, but it's around 10. And I love the Bible from day one. I opened the Bible as a brand new 10-year-old Christian, and I just loved it. I read John, I read Acts, I read Romans, and I just kept going, and I've been going ever since. And at one point I found out that the New Testament was written in Greek. So I thought, well, one day I'm going to learn how to do that. And so once my kids were a little bit older, that's what I did. Yeah. So I started learning online. I've since done university courses. I'm in a reading group that meets mostly once a week. And I'm really involved with reading Greek. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. And then in that reading, did egalitarianism come after you learned Greek, or was it more that you learned Greek to try to figure out some of these questions?
It was, let me think. It kind of sort of happened side by side because I never sought to be an egalitarian. I was quite content in some ways because I'm married to a very easygoing husband, for starters. So, and I'm quite easygoing in some ways as well. So we never, we were just ourselves.
Yeah.
So, how did it start? I don't know. Oh no, I do remember. Sorry about that.
So when it's been decades, everything just kind of blurs. I'm like that too.
So I think I was thinking more about marriage, and that has never been an issue, but it did become an issue with ministry. And I just felt, I think I was in my 40s, that God was leading me to be more of a leader in ministry. So that's where I started questioning things. And I really thought, no, I can't be a leader because I'm a woman. And I turned down opportunities to speak because I'm a woman. Mm-hmm. And so one day, this idea, this conflict was really in my mind. And I read Romans 12:6-8 in the NIV, the old NIV. And it said, if a man's gift is, so it had the word man, and then it had, I'm just going to say 8 masculine pronouns, let him, something like that. So I closed my NIV and I said to God, I literally said to God, see, I can't do that because that's all for men to do those ministries. And one of them is teaching, one of them is leading. there's other ministries too, like giving and stuff. Anyway, and then I thought, oh, look, I should check it out in the Greek. And I was really only just starting, but I did know enough to follow along. And I saw that in the Greek, that there was no word for man at all. The NIV had just stuck the word man in there. And there's not even a word for human, because, sometimes the Greek word for human is sometimes translated as man, but there's none of that. And there was just none of that masculine language. And in the new NIV, in almost all modern translations, Romans 12:6-8 is gender inclusive, with a few notable exceptions.
Yeah. Yes, like the ESV, which
the ESV, I have to say, is particularly, I'll just say bad on that, because I haven't counted how many ministries there are in this list in Romans 12:6-8. But they've translated all of them in a gender inclusive way, except for two, teaching and leading. Like, why? Why just add a masculine pronoun to those two? When it's similar grammatical construction all the way through. And I like to say that, because if someone looks it up, they might look at that in the Greek and go, well, there's masculine participles. But I say, well, the same grammatical construction that's repeated in Romans 12:6-8 is the same grammatical construction in John 3:16, for whosoever, for God so loved the world, that whoever believes is all masculine in John 3:16, because in Greek, the masculine grammatical gender is like the default.
Like in French, which I think people understand that if you know other languages, like in French.
If you know other languages, yeah. You know that grammatical language can mean absolutely nothing in some contexts. Yeah.
So if there's a group of people in French, it's ILS, right? Il, like the plural for he. So it's they as masculine, even if there's men and women together. So yeah, exactly. Okay, so you see that isn't true, and then you start to question if other stuff isn't true as well, or translated badly.
So that was really shocking for me when I read the Greek of Romans 12:6-8. I even cried because it really rocked me, because I really thought I couldn't do stuff. I didn't make a really concerted effort to look at things. It just slowly happened, and I don't know what happened next, but I guess my radar must have been out to see, well, do these verses really mean what they say they mean? And I don't want people to question our translations, because most of the time they're fine. But the Greek does bring you a bit closer, and because sometimes you just cannot translate things perfectly from one language into another, whatever those two languages may be.
Yeah, and that's why we need people like you who are on the front lines doing this, so that we don't have to. My husband loves Greek. My husband has learned a lot of Greek and is involved in some Greek groups as well. He doesn't do it as nearly as well as you, but he finds that really fun as well. I just can't do it. I'm not a language person, so. But I appreciate those of you who are. So I know there's so much that we could talk about, because, on your website, you have articles on Genesis 3, on Romans 16, on on 1 Timothy 2, all kinds of different passages, which people ask about with women. And I thought we can't do all of it, but I thought what we could do is the word head, because I get asked about this a lot. And it appears mostly in Ephesians 5 and 1 Corinthians 11. And I think that is something that people get really hung up on, is the idea of headship.
Sure.
So let's just jump in and tell me about Kephale. Is it Kephale? Kephale?
I pronounce it Kephale.
Kephale.
There's different there's even different schools of thought on how to pronounce ancient Greek, but I prefer Kephale. Yeah.
Okay. And Kephale is the Greek word for head that Paul uses.
Yeah. And most of the times, if you read this word in whatever Greek text, it means the thing on top of our heads. So I guess the first thing that I want to say about this word is if we look at the word head in English, a good English dictionary, you might have a whole page of definitions. And if you look at the Greek word, it's the same thing. There's a whole page of definitions and there's a whole lot of metaphorical uses. But people, Christians, they will just look at Ephesians 5:25 or 1 Corinthians 11:3, and where it talks about men, the man being the head of the woman, and they just go, it means he's the boss, the person in charge, the person with more spiritual authority than the woman. And to challenge that view is really difficult because in English especially, that's what head means. So you know French. So can I ask you, so tête, like the French, if they're using the word for head, they don't think that means, automatically thinks it means leader, do they?
Okay, I have grade 12 French, so I don't think I'm the right person to
Oh,
ask.
okay.
But yes, I mean, I've only ever known tête in to me like your physical
The
head.
actual head, yeah.
Yes.
And I know that and I looked this up in some French, I'm going off track a bit, hope that's okay. In some French um, Bible translations, because like I was in Europe last year and I was really disturbed. Like we think that there are some problems in some English translations. There are a lot more problems in French and Dutch and Korean translations, which really bothers me because it's so important that we have translations that accurately convey as best we can the underlying languages. So I did look up ages ago, Ephesians 5:23, I think it was, in French, and they didn't translate head as tête, which is the normal word for head. They had translated it to chef, which means,
Oh,
yeah,
okay. Yeah.
like the leader or the boss or the person in charge. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Anyway, let's not talk about French because I don't
Yeah.
really know about French. But yeah, it's yeah, that was sad. Anyway, so what am I saying? Where am I up
So
to?
so so Kephale,
Oh,
because I think what people don't know is that there's multiple words in Greek for head, and Paul uses a very specific one, right? Which is
oh no, I think just kephale means head. I don't know of another word, Greek word that means head.
oh, okay,
Like
because
the actual head.
right, but like for leader, for boss, you would use like
Oh, so you
RK or
yeah.
something else.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I thought you meant our actual head because there's
Yeah.
like there's pretty
Yes.
much only one Greek word for head. Yeah, so Paul is the only person in the New Testament to use the word kephale for a person or for
Hmm.
Jesus and once for God. So he uses it twice for a man, 7 times for Jesus and once for God. No other New Testament author, and New Testament authors were writing in Greek, uses the word head to talk about people who we know were leaders, who are military leaders or religious leaders or
Hmm.
community leaders. So the fact even that Paul is using this word is a little bit unusual.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yes.
because what you're saying is like when Paul is referring to leaders, he doesn't use Kephale or Kephale. He doesn't use Kephale. He uses like leader or
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So there's definitely a whole stack of other Greek words that you can use that meant leader, person in authority over others,
Hmm.
ruler. There's a whole stack of Greek words. Don't ask me what they are right now because it's 10
Right.
o'clock at night.
Right.
But yeah, so when Paul is using kephale, we have to pay attention because these are not the ordinary words that we would use to mean leader, yeah, in
Right.
Greek. And also, so in the Septuagint, so the Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible plus several other books as well. In the Hebrew Bible, about 180 times, the word Rosh quite clearly means a leader, a person with authority over other people.
Hmm.
But when they were translating the Septuagint when they were translating the Hebrew Bible into the Septuagint, there's almost no instances where those 180 times were then translated into Kephale.
Right.
So the translators of the Septuagint knew that Rosh, even though it means leader in Hebrew, and Rosh means head. I don't know if I said that. Rosh means head. That we can't just translate it into the Greek word for head, because Rosh as head can mean leader. Kephale in Greek doesn't usually mean leader. But there's a handful of exceptions, and these few exceptions have been pored over by scholars in great detail. And it could just be as simple as the translator wasn't totally careful when he was translating or something. But even the simple fact that there were 180 instances where the Hebrew word for head meant leader, and only sort of 5 or 6 or 7 have been translated as head in Greek.
Right.
I think it's significant. I hope that
Yeah,
wasn't too
because I think what you're
garbled.
saying is
Yeah.
like in Hebrew, the Hebrew word rosh is almost more like the English word head, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
so the Hebrew word for head and the English word for head have a lot in common. And when the Hebrew was translating head into Greek, they didn't use kephale.
yeah.
So
Most of the time they didn't.
so
Yeah,
like
yeah,
so we shouldn't think of it as leader either, which I think is super interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What
Oh, can I say something else too on that point?
yeah.
So quite a few scholars, Christian scholars, including Al Walters, who's a complementarian scholar, they say that in non-biblical ancient Greek, Kephale doesn't mean leader.
Hmm.
And I need to be clear what I mean by leader. And I think when we're discussing head, we really need to use our language carefully. We need to be precise, because people can be so casual with some of their expressions. And, we really need to see what Paul's saying. So when I say leader, I mean a person with leadership authority over other people.
Hmm.
Because you can have a leader who's the first person in line or something, and that person doesn't have authority over other people necessarily. So when I'm using the word leader, I'm talking about a person with leadership authority over other people. And people like Al Walters, there's a few people, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, which is like 12 volumes, so they go in detail into all the Greek words. They say, yeah, it doesn't mean leader or person in authority in secular Greek. But some people, because of the Septuagint's use,
Hmm.
um, then it becomes a little bit muddier, because in the Septuagint, there's this handful of times where head can mean leader in the Greek. So there's a lexicon, which is sort of known as Brill-Dag. It was published by Brill. And they say in that lexicon, well, it can mean leader, but the citation they give is in the Septuagint, the
Hmm.
ancient Greek version of the Old Testament. Yeah,
Yeah.
because of this handful of times. Yeah.
When they translate it that way. And like you're saying, you just don't see it when you look at secular, which means when you look
Mm,
outside of religious texts, like we have lots and lots of Greek texts of other
yeah.
things. It isn't
We
just the
have
Bible.
lots. Yeah.
And when you look at other Greek things, the philosophers writing, etc.,
Yeah.
Kephale didn't mean
Yeah.
someone in
And
authority.
yeah,
Yeah.
Richard Servan, I quote him a few times when I'm talking. He has been through all these lexicons of Xenophon, Plato, a whole bunch of Herodotus. I hope I'm saying it right. And he said it's not there. And I went to my university library once and looked up as many as I could, and yeah, they don't have a meaning. So, like, this isn't controversial. It's not
Right.
controversial that ordinarily in untranslated Greek, text originally written in Greek,
Mhm.
Kephale does not mean a person with leadership authority over other people. It's not
Right.
controversial.
Okay. So what does it mean?
Yeah. Um, so to understand Paul's use, because that's what we want to know,
Mhm.
we really need to look at the context. Also, how he uses it in Ephesians, I think, is slightly different to how he uses it in 1 Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul uses it 3 times. He uses the word head, Kephale, 3 times in Ephesians 1, Ephesians 4, and Ephesians 5. And how he uses it is really significant. So in each of those 3 instances, he uses it in a head and body metaphor, which he doesn't do in 1 Corinthians. Well, hang on, let me just think. Not exactly anyway. But it's what Paul is saying about what's happening between the head and the body that is really remarkable. And it's something that I continue to really ponder on, because it's really hard to understand what Paul is saying. And part of that is because I don't think most of us, myself included, really appreciate Paul's incredible view of salvation. I think a lot of our views of salvation is too small. Like Paul had this incredible view of salvation. Okay, so in Ephesians 1, the word head occurs once, but it's used in 2 different ways. But when he's talking about the body, he's talking about, and that's us, that's the church. That's about us sort of being the fullness of Christ. So we've got Christ as the head, and then we've got his body, and we're the fullness of Christ. In Ephesians 1, he also talks about everyone else being under the feet of Christ. So with head, I really think we need to think of what head means spatially. Head is at the top of the body, feet is at the bottom, and the top usually has more status, it's more prominent. The head usually has sort of more honor, if you want to, and I'd like to talk about that a bit more. But so we've got the head, and like if you look at Ephesians 1, it's all about Christ's incredible status compared with everything else. But we are not under his feet, we are his body, and we are supposed to embody his fullness. I don't really know what that means, but it's pretty amazing. In Ephesians 4, it's a lot easier to understand, thankfully. And there again, we've got head, Christ is the head, the church is his body. But in Ephesians 4, it's all about us becoming like Christ, measuring up to the stature of Christ, like growing up to the maturity of Christ. So it's not like Jesus is like way up there and like we're way down there. It's like we are supposed to grow to become to the maturity and stature of Christ. So we need to have these ideas in mind when we get to chapter 5, because in chapter 5, we again have Christ and the church as the metaphor, as the analogy for marriage. And if we think that the analogy is that wives are supposed to be subordinate, we have completely missed Paul's point.
Yeah, we missed the theology of Christ and the church.
And people tend to focus on, so in Ephesians 5, beginning verse 22 to 33, it's all about marriage. And so one of the examples that Paul gives about Christ's example is that he gave himself up for the church. And so people look at that and go, yep, Jesus died for us. He was crucified in a horrific death. That's the example for husbands. But that's only half the story, because also I think Ephesians 5 verses 22 to 33 is written as a chiasm. So the main point of the chiasm is the central point. And the central point of this passage is that Christ presents the church to himself in splendor, in glory, in high esteem. And that Greek word there is endoxis, which isn't just glory. So if you look in any major lexicon, the first definition they have is high esteem. So Christ lowered himself. He gave himself up for her. for the church, not just in his death. He did that as soon as he became human.
That's kind of like Philippians 2, right? That we are to
Yeah,
have the mind of Christ, who
yeah,
didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself
yeah,
nothing. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, everything about Jesus' earthly existence is about, he literally came down to our level. He
Hmm.
lowered himself. He gave himself for us. That's the example for husbands. But like I said, that's only half the story. Christ also raises the church up and presents her to himself in glory. So again, you know, raises, presents herself in glory. We have this elevation. Um,
Hmm.
so what that means, what that meant for the Ephesians, I think is slightly different to what it can mean for us today. Because in first century Ephesus, I mean, this letter was probably written not just to the Ephesians, but to other
Hmm.
churches in Asia Minor as well, as a circular letter. So in that time, men did have a higher status than women.
Hmm.
Husbands did have a higher level of honor than their wives, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking. Um, so, what Paul is saying to the husbands is basically lower yourself and lift up
Hmm.
your wife. I really think that's what he's saying. And we focus so much on, the verses to wives, where Paul doesn't really give, or I mean, that's where the example is of Christ as the head, but he doesn't really elaborate on the submission. And submission is another word that I've really been looking at a lot lately, because I used to say that this was a normal behavior for first century women, but it actually only occurs twice. Submission, this word, the verb hupotasso, only occurs twice in ancient texts about wives hupotassoing to their husbands. So it isn't even the ordinary word for
Hmm.
wifely behavior. I mean, people like Plutarch would just use words like obey,
Right.
and stronger words, and they would use much stronger words for husbands. And Plutarch was a reasonably good guy. So Plutarch was writing around the same time as Paul, and he wrote this little essay to a couple that he was very fond of, who were getting married. And he just says, yeah, the husband is the leader, using some of these other words. The husband, um, he uses like he actually says the husband is the decision maker. You never see
Hmm.
that in the New Testament, despite
Hmm.
what some people say. But Plutarch actually says the husband is the decision maker. And he frames it a bit nicely. But he uses the word submission once for wives there, and it's also in another ancient Greek text about Alexander the Great's mum submitting to Alexander the Great's dad when the dad had really been not nice to her. And it's so submission is really used in those two texts and in other Greek texts to create harmony in relationships. And sort of while I'm on submission, because I know we want to talk about head, there are texts that show that submission isn't always to a person in authority. So some people, and I don't want to name names, but some scholars have said point blank, submission is always to a person in
Which
authority.
makes no sense for Ephesians 5:21, because we're supposed to submit to one another. So
Yeah,
unless
yeah,
everybody is an authority over you, yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
it doesn't. So there's the letter to Aristeas, which was written 200, 100 BC. And this king is asking for advice on how he can get along with people. And the advice is to the king, they use this verb, hupotasso.
Hmm.
So this king, he's a king. He's got like the highest authority. He's not submitting to a person with higher authority, but he's acquiescing, or he's getting along with people. He's not being a jerk, if I can say that. There's another one in one of the Maccabees letters, one of the Maccabees books, and I have to think hard how that story goes. But again, it's a king who is besieging Jerusalem, and he finds out that there's problems back in his country, so he has to go back and sort that out. So he tries to make up with the Jews. And so he hupotassos to the Jews. He makes up with them and so tries to sort things out while he goes off and sorts out his own problem back home. He's not acquiescing to a person in authority over others. He's just trying to smooth things over and mend relationships. Yeah. And there's others. There's
Right.
plenty in the early church fathers as well who talk about mutual submission. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is like this passage is not setting up an authority system. It's instead trying to tell us that our relationship should be about our attitude, the way that Christ had this attitude
Yeah.
of giving to others, but then elevating those who are lower
Yeah.
and coming down to people's levels so that we are
Yeah.
all in unity in
Yeah.
Christ. Yeah.
And if you look in 1 Corinthians 12, which I've got somewhere here, Paul says that, so 1 Corinthians 12, like one of the most amazing passages, which is all about the body.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I don't know if I can find it quickly. Let me see if I can find it quickly. He talks about, I think it's, here we go. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, and neither can the head say to the feet. And again, I think head and feet is talking about social status. I have no need of you. And then Paul goes on to say, this is 1 Corinthians 12, verses 20 to 22. On the contrary, rather the members of the body, and that's people who are weaker, and this could be socially weaker. Paul often uses the word weaker to talk about socially disadvantaged people. The weaker are indispensable, and the members we think are less honourable, to these we bestow greater honour. So you see this idea in Paul's letters. He wants this levelling of honour. And he goes on.
Doesn't that reckon back to Isaiah, where it talks about how the crooked paths will be made straight, and the valleys will be brought up and the mountains will be brought low
Maybe.
in
I
the
don't
day of the
know that
Lord? I
much
just
about
I
Isaiah. Yeah, it could.
it
Yeah,
sounds so much like that to me. How
yeah,
how God in the day of the Lord, he brings the valleys up and he brings the mountain low so that we will have a
yeah.
straight path.
Ah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll have to look at that. So in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says, that we have to bestow greater honor on those who we think are less honorable, and on our supposedly undignified members, we treat them with greater dignity, which, and I'm quoting, which our prominent members don't need. So the people who already have honor, the people who are already prominence, we don't need to give them more honor. We're supposed to be giving more honor to the people who don't have it. And then Paul goes on, but God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the members that lacked it. This is God who's doing this, so that there be no division in the body, but that members may have the same care for one another. So it's all about unity. It's treating each other the same, about trying to get rid of this imbalance between who is honor and who doesn't have honor. So that's in 1 Corinthians 12, which we should keep in mind when we're looking at 1 Corinthians 11, which is in the previous chapter. So I really do think, so when I look, so we can't just look at Paul either. We need to see how other first century authors were using Kephale, and they don't use it a lot for people, but they do use it sometimes. So Philo was writing about the same time as Paul. Yeah, I think that's right, because I think Philo died in 50 AD 50. So writing just a bit before Paul's time. And he just explains really clearly what head means to him in some of his writings. And I've got this on my website if people want to look it up. He says, as the head is to the body, occupying the preeminence of situation. So we've got the spatial idea of top or elevated position that seems to be behind this metaphorical understanding. And this is in rewards and this is in his essay on rewards and punishment. And he also uses the word first. He says, "For as in an animal, the head is the first and best part, and the tail the last and worst part." Because in the Hebrew Bible, you have these head and tail metaphors. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned that before. So in those handful of times in the Hebrew Bible, when Rosh means leader, and I said like only 5 are translated as head in Greek, I still find it really that difficult to say succinctly. But in Hebrew, there are 7 head-tail metaphors where head is the best bit and the tail is the worst bit, basically. And Philo uses it as well. And then he goes on to say that a virtuous man shall be the head of the human race, whether he be a single man or a whole people. But a virtuous man isn't the boss of the whole human race, but he might have sort of a superiority to the whole human race, or he might be an influence to the whole human race. But no one seriously thinks that Philo is saying that a virtuous man is the person in authority over the whole human race.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Right.
and I have others like that. So sometimes if you're a person and you're a head in the Greek way of understanding it, and you're a prominent person, you have a higher status or a higher level honor, you can also be a leader. But I really believe that in and of itself, the word Kephale did not mean a leader with a person in authority over other people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting because when people say, well, God commands men to be the leader, and you ask them, where does it say that?
Yeah.
Like, where
Yeah.
is there a verse that
Yeah.
says to men, lead your wives? And they say, well,
Yeah.
it calls men head.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but it that's not what it means. And
Yeah.
so when you realize that, the whole argument that men lead their wives falls apart.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no verse in the New Testament where Jesus or Paul or Peter or anyone says, men, lead your wives, men, be the spiritual authorities of your wives, men, be whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because even these verses in Ephesians 5:23, where Paul is talking about this analogy of Christ and the church, he's actually saying that to the wives. He's not even saying that to the men. I mean, the men, of course, are listening. So there's no verse where Paul or anyone says to husbands, okay, now you be the boss, you be in charge, make the decisions, which is just a made up idea.
Yes, yes, it's not there.
There are so many made up ideas that people think are really in the Bible, and I just come. So it doesn't even say husband is the head of the house.
Yeah,
Which is
and
the one that
the closest is actually, it says women are. In Titus, doesn't it say like women are the whatever of the household, like the managers?
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the despot of the house. Like it actually says it about women.
Yeah. Yeah. And also it says it in Esther 1. But this is Xerxes. This is the pagan king Xerxes, who has got his nose out of joint because Vashti has snubbed him. So he makes a decree, except they don't use the word head, but they do say that the husband needs to sort of be in charge of the house. But, I often say we don't take our cues for living as Christians from Xerxes or from the fall.
Yeah. Now, interesting, in Love and Respect, Emerson Eggerichs quotes Xerxes' words in a positive way.
Okay.
Yeah, which is just crazy because the whole point was that Xerxes was in the wrong here. And him doing that set off this chain of events. Which was like bad.
Yeah. And most scholars who understand Esther, they see Esther as a bit of a farce, that the author is lampooning the Persians and poking fun at people like Xerxes, and that his reaction is an absurd overreaction. It's not good advice.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Okay, so let's go to 1 Corinthians 11 now, because I think that people do have a lot of issues with that.
Sure.
Perhaps even I think they might get lead even more from First Corinthians 11 than they do from Ephesians 5 in some ways, because it seems to say, that just as Christ is head of man and therefore man is head of woman, etc. Although the
Yeah.
order, if you mean that, the order is wrong, but I'll let you
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
let you do that.
it's if you
Yeah.
think it's a hierarchy of status or a hierarchy of anything, um, usually hierarchy they go from greatest to least or least to greatest, but there's anyway. Okay, the first thing I want to point out with 1 Corinthians 11:3, which uses the word head 3 times, I think, and that whole passage is that it's about men and women praying and prophesying in church. And
Hmm.
the men and women are doing exactly the same thing. And Paul is not telling them to stop praying and prophesying. He's not telling the women to pray and prophesy. He's addressing something about either their hairstyles or head coverings, or maybe a bit of both. And I have my own theories about that. So, first off, the men and women are doing exactly the same thing.
Hmm.
It's about ministry. It's not about marriage. It's about
Hmm.
ministry. Whereas Ephesians 5, definitely like it's about marriage. So another thing, I think most New Testament scholars would agree that Ephesians 11:2-16 is one of the most difficult passages to work out, because he seems to be saying something in the first
First
half.
Corinthians. You said if
Oh,
you mean
First
First
Corinthians.
Corinthians, yeah,
Oh,
11, 2
okay.
to 16.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So the first half seems to be saying something, and the second half seems to be saying something quite different.
Hmm.
And because it is.
Hmm.
And the way I explain that is it's 2 different social contexts. That's how I explain it. So in the first half, beginning at verse 2 to verse 10, Paul is talking about reputations, about the social respectability of the Corinthians. And that culminates in verse 10, which again is the crux or the center of the chiasm, because I think there's a chiasm
Okay,
there as
and,
well.
and and explain chiasm to people who don't
Okay,
know.
sure. Yeah, so I'm not one of these people that sees a chiasm everywhere, but there's lots of chiasms in Jewish literature. Okay, so a chiasm is when there's a series of points being made until a central point is reached, and then the same ideas are repeated in some way, shape, or form. And it's so a chi. He is a Greek letter that looks a bit like an X, but a chiasm actually. Anyway,
Mhm.
so yeah, there's repeated statements. Then there's the main point, and then there's other repeated statements. And so the main point in Ephesians, not
And
Ephesians,
in English we don't really do this because in English we make our point first and then we explain.
yeah,
So we think the first statement is the most important, but often in Greek it's the middle statement that's the most important, not the first. And so we often use the first as the thing that tells us how to interpret the middle when really we should be doing the opposite.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Or sometimes we lead up to our main point, but yeah, the main
Yeah.
point is in the
Hmm.
middle. And there's all sorts of ways that you can spot if something's a chiasm. Okay, so the central point in 1 Corinthians, I need to say 1 Corinthians and not Ephesians, is the verse about the angels. Do I have that here? Let's have a look. Verse 10. For it is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority on her own head because of the angels. So what does that mean? Yeah. I think I know what it means.
Yeah, sure,
Something that
sure.
really bugs me about Ephesians 5. So some people will say that men have this unique instruction to lay down their lives for their wives, which
Hmm.
is how giving up is interpreted. And that's just, we need to read the whole chapter. If we look at Ephesians 5, verse 2, Paul uses almost exactly the same language where he tells all his audience that all of us are to love as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. It's exactly the same Greek word, just a few words are just switched out here and there. So loving sacrificially is not just for husbands, it's for everyone. And
Hmm.
submission isn't just for wives, it's for everyone. So when we're trying to understand Ephesians 5:23 and the head thing, the head verse, we need to at least start at the beginning of chapter 5. But ideally, we need to start at chapter 1 to see how Paul is using head and body in chapter 1, in chapter 4, and then we get to chapter 5, and then we understand what it means that Jesus is the savior of the body and husbands aren't the savior. All of us can look up to Jesus as our role model, but there's definite limitations about what we can do. Anyway, so let's get back to 1 Corinthians. I just wanted to say those things.
Yes, very good.
Okay. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of early church fathers who understood 1 Corinthians 11:3, which we probably should read out because I don't think we've read it out yet. Or did I just read it out?
No. Go ahead and read it.
So I'm reading from the new NIV. I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Yeah, so what does that mean? So
that's where you see that the order's wrong. If you're talking about, because you should say the head of every woman is man, the head of man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. If you were going to do hierarchy, you would do it that way.
Yeah, but it's not sequential, at all. Yeah. So a whole bunch of early church fathers think that this is talking about the origins of Jesus, of man and of woman. And I did write down a quick quote from
of Ambrosiaster. Is that who you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got it. I've got it in your notes.
You've got it?
Yes.
Oh, okay, you read it then.
Okay. God is the head of Christ because he begat him. Christ is the head of the man because he created him. And the man is the head of the woman because she was taken from his side.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So it's about creation. And I think it's about firstness. So David De Silva.
And just to clarify, we know that Christ was forever, but it means like he's talking about Christ on earth, not Christ in his
So Christology isn't my strong suit, but even like the early church fathers talked about Christ eternally proceeding from the Father. So there's still this idea of source, even though source isn't my favorite word to describe head in. So I think there is an idea of origins. I think there's an idea of firstness in 1 Corinthians 11:3. I don't think there's these ideas in Ephesians. And that's why I know some people try to find one unified definition for how Paul uses head. I don't think there is one. What I do think from reading other Greek literature is that there is always at least a nuance of higher status in the head or a higher level of authority. And I know that idea can play into patriarchal thinking. But what we need to do, and I just really wish people would do this, is we need to read Paul's words in context. Because there are times when it sounds like Paul's building up this case for patriarchy, and then he totally pulls the rug out from under it. So like in Ephesians 5, husbands, lower yourselves, but lift your wives, and the idea that the church as the body of Christ becomes like Christ. Okay, so here too, if we look at the first half, I think Paul wanted the Corinthians, who were a little bit wild, everyone, their worship services sound like pretty full on, and people are talking over each other. If you read 1 Corinthians 14, people are just getting up and speaking, and some people aren't getting a turn because people are hogging the floor, and women are asking all kinds of questions because they want to learn. So it sounds a little bit and people are giving up on marriage because they think the resurrection has come. That's 1 Corinthians 7. So there's some pretty out there spiritual people in the Corinthian church. And I think Paul wanted the men and the women, because he addresses the men as well in 1 Corinthians 11. Admittedly, he addresses the women more, but the men were a bit out there as well. So he's saying, and I think he's talking about hairstyles. I think he wanted the men to have short hairstyles, which was the respectable hairstyle in first century Roman cities and Roman colonies. And Corinth was a Roman colony. So
Hmm.
we tend to think maybe that it was Greek, but it had been built as a Roman colony by Augustus with Roman rules, with Latin speakers, and yeah. Anyway, and he wanted the women to have their hair or respectable. So I actually think that some of the women were cutting their hair short. I don't know if
Hmm.
that's getting way too much off track, but we know we have a whole bunch of early church texts which mention women like Thecla who cut their hair short, who looked like guys, and to fully devote themselves to God, because there was kind of this idea that of sexual, I mean, there was a big movement of sexual renunciation in the early
Yes.
church, starting with 1 Corinthians 7. You see it in 1 Timothy. So that's pretty early, because this is the
Yeah.
50s, that people are already giving up on marriage, that people are completely giving up on sex. And so gender distinctions weren't being, they were being blurred, let's say that. And that's what I think 1 Corinthians 11 in the first half is all about. Paul wanted the men to look like first century Roman men. He wanted the women to look like first century Roman women, because of the angels. And I don't think the angels refers to spiritual beings. I think it refers to people who saw the Corinthians church going a little bit crazy, because the church was new, the church was
Yeah.
small, and Romans were really suspicious of religious movements that might be subversive. The Christians were. There's a whole bunch of texts where Christians defend their Christianity and to show that it wasn't subversive, and letters
Hmm.
written to emperors to go, no, we're really not cannibals, we're really
Right.
not,
Yeah.
or we're really not atheists, which was a bad thing to be, defending their Christian faith.
And I think
Okay,
that's important to see that Paul, like Paul, one of Paul's big concerns was to make sure that the church didn't become so out there or so countercultural that it came in ill repute and then the Romans
yeah,
wouldn't go. And so, he in many ways, and you can see this throughout Paul's letters, he's accepting the power systems of the time. He's not trying to overthrow the power systems of the
yeah,
time. He's
which would
just
have been
saying,
impossible because we're talking about Rome.
right. And so
Yeah.
and that's why, in the Bible, he's not explicitly anti-slavery, right? Like he
Mm,
talks about how slaves connect, how masters connect. So he's not saying,
yeah,
but that doesn't mean that Paul supported slavery, right?
no,
But he's saying, given that this is the culture we live in, what are we going to do to be Christians in that
yes,
culture?
yeah,
But we want our church not to be condemned by Rome, and we want our church to appeal to people and not
yeah,
to seem so freaky and
yeah,
cultish, right?
yeah.
So, yeah.
And being a Christian could be dangerous.
Hmm.
I, I don't think we see that a lot, but Paul definitely knew how dangerous it could be to be
Hmm.
a Christian. It says that Priscilla and Aquila risked their necks for Paul, so they had been in danger.
Hmm.
It's literally risked their necks. Junior had been in prison, and prisons in those times were awful.
Hmm.
Paul, from the moment sorry, Paul, before he was saved, um, persecuted, handed over men and women,
Hmm.
and some were killed. So to be a Christian was risky.
Hmm.
And Paul wanted to minimize those risks as much as possible.
Hmm.
And so a lot of, especially in the pastoral epistles, some of the advice, I'll call it advice, some of the instructions that he gives to women and to men too are so, and especially in 1 Peter, which isn't Paul at all, it's because in 1 Peter, we definitely see that people were being persecuted, they were being slandered, they were having a tough time, the wives as well. And Peter's advice is, don't sort of fight back against it too much because that's going to end in disaster.
Yeah.
Basically, he doesn't say that, but that's the message. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of verses in Paul's letters and also in 1 Peter And the advice has to be read with the understanding that they had to conform to society to some extent for the sake of outsiders, but within the church, getting back to 1 Corinthians 11, things are different. So in the first half of 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 to 10, Paul really wanted the men and women who were praying and prophesying, who were ministering, to have their hair or their heads in socially respectable hairstyles. And he brings in the idea of status in verse 3. Like, we think probably he could have done that a bit clearer, but that's what he chose to do. He talks about this idea of firstness, which is linked to status. Did I really quote David De Silva?
No.
He says, I'll have to just paraphrase, because he says, however we might interpret head in 1 Corinthians 11:3, the idea of firstness is hard to escape. And the firstness is tied to status. But then in the second half of this passage, and I think it starts with nevertheless, or like Paul didn't want them to take it too far. He says, but in the Lord, and that's us, in the Lord. And then he says, man is not independent of woman, and woman is not independent of man. And then instead of, having this hierarchy of firstness, he says everything comes from God. God is the ultimate first one. That's the only one that really matters.
Yeah.
So to understand 1 Corinthians 11, I think we have to understand the two different contexts. And I know other people have explained it in other ways, but I really do think it's reputations in broader Corinth outside the church and relationships within the church. And to me, and also like Paul then says in the second half that a woman's long hair is her covering, which makes me think that the women were, at least some of the women were cutting their hair. When they were announcing sex, they were cutting their hair.
Right. Super interesting. I love it. So anyway, the point that I want y'all to hear as you listen to this is that those people who say it's obvious, like the plain reading of scripture is that men lead their wives, it isn't. It isn't. And anyone who approaches the Bible with fairness and with um with true curiosity and with humility, and we'll see that this is way more complicated. And when we focus on the actual gospel message, you get away from the idea of hierarchy. Like Jesus, if you focus just on Jesus in the gospels, every time there's hierarchy, he brings it down.
The first will be last.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be that way with you, people.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. And so when people say, oh, but the whole reason that God, the whole message about marriage to us is that it's supposed to be a hierarchy, it's like you've missed the entire point then. And where are you getting that from? And so people who talk about the plain reading of scripture, it's like, no, that's not, they're saying that to make you stop asking questions.
Yeah. And when you think about 1 Corinthians 11, people in the past, especially, they made women cover their heads, and they also stopped them from speaking, which doesn't make any sense at all, because it's all about men and women praying and prophesying in church. Like, people just pick and choose which bits they want to focus on. Yeah. Like Paul never silenced sound teaching. He never silenced edifying speech from anyone. All the verses that sound like Paul is trying to shut down women, and he also shuts down men, but we don't focus on those. It's because there was something problematic in what they were saying in Corinth and in Ephesus. Paul never shut down Priscilla. He never shut down other women. Paul does, offer, address bad behavior and offers corrections to bad behavior. But so in 1 Corinthians 11, the women were praying and prophesying, and Paul doesn't tell them to stop.
Yeah. Exactly. And I love the point that first learned this from you in Romans 16 when Paul is mentioning all of these people, like you're saying, okay, say hi to this person, say hi to this
Yeah,
person,
yeah.
this thing, you know, um, what was it, 10 of 29? Is that the number? Is that right?
Oh, I'm so bad with numbers, which is why I wrote this article.
I
I
think
think
it's,
it's 29, but there's 28 based in Rome because there's Phoebe, who's in the first two verses of Romans 16. And then I
yeah,
think there's 28 Romans after
yeah.
that. Yeah.
And 10 of them are female, and 7 of those females are mentioned in relation to the work they do for Christ,
Yeah.
like in their
Yeah.
ministry roles. And
Yeah.
so, that's a lot. That's a very high proportion of
Yeah.
women.
Yeah. And who's the first person in Rome to be greeted in that list? It's a
Yeah.
woman, it's Priscilla.
Yeah.
So the very first person based in Rome that Paul says say hi, it's
Yeah.
a woman. Um,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's yeah, and it's
Yeah.
it's just people. Actually, I do know some people. I think Michael Bird and others have said that Romans 16 was the passage that changed their mind.
Yeah.
Um, but some people still can't look at that. I just had a really awful conversation with someone, and which focused on Priscilla, and he'll just say, oh, but they can't teach because of, 1 Timothy 2:12. And I'm
Yeah.
going, "Well, she's clearly teaching in Acts. She not only is she clearly teaching a man, she's teaching a man who is himself teaching, who is recognized as an eloquent teacher, and who is accurately teaching the way of God. This is in Acts
Yeah.
18, but he didn't quite have something about baptism. So she corrects a teacher, and it's usually the job of elders and overseers to do that. And
Yeah.
Luke has no problem in telling the story. Paul has no problem with greeting Priscilla, first of 28 Christians based in Rome. Um, it's not Paul and the author of Acts who has a problem with Priscilla. It's other people that can't see what she's actually doing. And then
Right.
they try to import all these different ideas like, she wasn't teaching in a church setting.
And she was
Um,
under the headship of her husband.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really it's like, no, honey, you're the one who's not actually reading the scripture. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Well, Mark, tell you have I don't know how many articles you have on your site, but it's got to be hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds now.
It's several hundreds. It actually
Yes.
is. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things when you go to Mark's site, in her menu bar, you can just choose from different Bible passages. Like you can look up everything she's ever written on First Corinthians 11, everything on Ephesians 5, everything on Genesis 3, everything on First Timothy 2, etc. But you can also look for concepts like submission or whatever. There's lots of different
I've got
concepts
one
you can
on
look.
just on Kephale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just yes. I clicked on that this morning. So yeah, so just go to her site and the articles are all super short, very bite-sized, very easy to understand. And she really translates all of this for us. So I really appreciate what you do. You're one of the few people that I support on Patreon as well. So
Thank you.
yes. So you can
Thank
check out, I'll
you.
put a link to Mark's Patreon as well. Because she does all of this free of charge and she offers such an immense service that I really appreciate. So yeah, any last words that you want to say to people?
I think what I often close with when I'm speaking is that Paul actually loved women.
Hmm.
Um, I really think he was buddies with Priscilla and Aquila. He valued Phoebe. Uh, he says really nice things about women, but we just tend to focus on those verses where he seems to limit women. And like I said, where he does limit women, it's either for women to conform to certain social norms, or it's because these particular women were misbehaving in some ways. But it's not all women.
Hmm.
Yeah. So Paul mentions about 18 women, I think it is, most of them by name. And he says really nice things about them. And I just really wish we could appreciate that. And I wish we could appreciate Paul's view of salvation, because it's big, it's magnificent, it's incredible. And when we understand that, then we can understand what he's saying in Ephesians 5 a bit better as well. I think our view of salvation sometimes is a bit too small.
Yeah. Oh, the most common question I get, one of the most common questions I get, and I always refer to you for this one, is what Bible translation is best? And I always link to your article on it, which I will put in the podcast notes. But what do you use? What do you use, and what do you?
Okay. So if I need an English translation, I actually use, and I need to say it right because I often say, it's the CSB, which is the Christian Standard Bible. And a lot of people are horrified because it's published by a Complementarian publisher. But I continue to be delighted with it, absolutely delighted. There's a few verses that I don't like. They downplay Phoebe and Junior's ministry, but there's other bits that I think are spot on and they do better. So I do have an article, and in that article that you linked to, I have a few verses where I think the CSB could do better. So because I actually do read the New Testament in Greek, that's my main Bible, but I can't use that when I'm teaching and when I'm writing. So then I need to find an English translation. So I would look on Bible Gateway to see what English translations matched what I thought it was saying. And after a while, I realized I'm just picking the CSB all the time, almost all the time, except for Phoebe and Priscilla and a few other verses. And so now that's the first one I look at now. And yeah, I don't know how it's gotten through this Complementarian publisher. It's really good. I also like the NIV, the new NIV, 2011 edition. I also like the Common English Bible. No, See, this is why I get mixed up with CSB and CEB. I like the Common English Bible because they break with tradition. Because there's a lot of Christianese jargon where it's not exactly, it could be better. And Common English Bible goes, this is what we think it means. And I go, yep, I think you're right. So it's always good to have, we're spoilt for choice, and we have these resources free online. So yeah. A lot of people like the New Revised Standard Version. I think they're spot on with how they translate the expression husband of one wife. So that's a whole other ball game. I think they're spot on with that, but I don't like the style. It's too chunky for me.
Yeah, that's what I use. That's the one I use, but I know what you mean. It is chunky. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. And I'm going to link to margmowczko.com, which is, and Marg is really easy to spell, M-A-R-G. Mowczko is M-O-W-C-Z-K-O, M-O-W-C-Z-K-O, but the link is going to be in the podcast notes, so you can find it there. Find Marg. I will link to everything she's written on 1 Corinthians 11, everything on Ephesians 5. But you can just go and browse her website, and you'll go down lots of rabbit trails. It'll be lots of fun. So thank you. And
thanks so much for having me.
Yes, and good night to you. I'm just beginning my day as you're finishing it. But yeah, hopefully I will see you again in real life one day.
Yeah,
so.
I'd love to. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Marg.
Okay. Bye, Sheila.
You know, I say the phrase, the link is in the podcast notes all of the time on this podcast, and likely a lot of the time it just goes right over your head. But please hear me on this. The link to Marg's website is in the podcast notes, and you need to check out this link because her website is so rich. And I have sent so many people there who have come back and told me that reading Marg's stuff really changed how they approach the Bible, because they were starting to feel so despondent about God, wondering if the Bible was even for them because it seemed so negative towards women. They were always taught that God was so negative towards women, and just reading Marg's heart and seeing what it actually says is so freeing. So please do check out margmowczko.com. And again, that's hard to spell, so check out the link in the podcast notes. A couple of housekeeping things to share with you. The month of June, I am taking off of the blog. We're recording a video series to go along with our book study for our new book, The Marriage You Want. So The Marriage You Want has a separate study guide, which has small group curriculum, couples curriculum, and more, premarital curriculum. And Keith and I are actually using the premarital curriculum to walk through with a couple that we know who's about to get married. So we're actually using it ourselves too. But the video curriculum should be ready in the fall. So we're filming that this month. And I'm going to be starting to write my next book in June and July. So we won't be on the blog. I will be on my Substack, but not on the blog. And in July, we're also going to be taking off the podcast. So there'll be podcasts for the rest of June and then starting up again in August. So we'll be taking July off for the summer. But thank you all for sticking around with me. I really appreciate the community. I appreciate especially all the comments that have been coming in on YouTube and the letters that we've been getting. I just love it. Love hearing from all of you. And I hope you've really enjoyed our conversation with Marg. And we'll be back next week for the Bare Marriage Podcast again. Bye-bye.